All right, so we're going to go back into our session. So in the first half, we talked about the equipment, materials, supplies, the public works, which is a huge topic. We talked about all the different pieces, and now we're going to get into services a little bit. And when we talk about services in general, I break them into 3 buckets. That's how we talk about them in MRSC. You've got your personal services, your professional services, and I've sometimes seen when we talk about personal and professional, they'll get blended together when that term's used. I'm going to show you a little bit of distinction between the two. And then we'll talk about purchase service, where the interesting piece, which we touched on earlier this morning, is that when you're in the purchase services space, you've also got some prevailing wage things to consider. So I'm going to give you some examples of some different projects where it may or may not be prevailing wage. And we'll even use an example that's in the conservation guide that separates some different things for you to look at when we get to that part. So I mentioned here's the 3 different things. We've got personal, purchase, professional, which gets us to our follow-up exercise on what is your conservation district doing in general around services. So this is from the guide again on the recommended levels. These are very similar to the equipment ones, but I'm curious, what is your conservation district doing around services? And, you know, is it services in general? Do you have a distinction between whether it's purchase service, personal, or A&E services? Is there a different limit, or is it all the same, if any? So at your table, there's a sheet there that says services, and there's a list for the minimal, informal, and formal. If you could fill that out for me, just like we did this morning on what you know about your service limits, I'll do the same thing as this morning and put them up so we can see, is there consistency or is there any differences from conservation district to conservation district? So just take, let's see, give you 5 minutes here to put together. It seems like everyone's able to do that in 5. Just take a look at the services and we'll come back. But I'll give myself 10 minutes. I found I couldn't put together a spreadsheet in 5. So I've learned and adjusted. So let's take 5 minutes to do that, and then I'll show it to everybody and see where we're at. So when I'm talking about services, this is anything from hiring a consultant to do an analysis for you, or like a study. It's doing an engineer services contract to do an estimate for you, or it's purchase service. Someone's doing some maintenance within your conservation district. And you may or may not have a separate policy just for services. You may just have a general policy that covers both equipment and services. A lot of different entities that set their own policy will make their equipment and services one encompassing dollar limit. There are no wrong answers with this exercise. Yeah, but for A&E, so I'll touch on that. So in the contracting tool, it means there's nothing in statute as far as requirements, as far as dollar limits or determining how you go out to market. All right. I think I'm going to go around and start collecting the overview here. Start over here and walk around. All right.
Right. We did all together. So you
Oh,
are
good.
Yeah.
we got.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I got everyone here. I
I
grabbed.
just did one for our
Well,
whole.
Thanks. Thank you. Anyone here got these fun? You got them over here ahead of me? All right.
It's not our turn.
All right. I'm gonna see if I can get this done in under 10 minutes. So give me 10 minutes and I will put this together. All right, I'm back. Sorry, for some reason it's not showing on the screen. Give me just a moment. I think I know why. It's probably because. All right, did it in under 10 minutes. Fantastic. Okay, why is this not showing? All right, let me try something here. Okay, maybe I'll just talk through this. Here's what it looks like. Most people, most of the conservation districts are consistently using the recommendations 1040. A large majority of the group is. Now there's a couple here I had some questions on though. So let me pull them up here real quick. Hey, look at that. Okay. Okay, so Mason Conservation District, it looks like. Let me see why it's not. I need my 12-year-old here. She'd be able to solve this for me. Why is this not? It work? Oh yeah, there we go. Woo, thank you. So. Oops. There we go. Okay. So Mason Conservation District, my assumption is you're just going out to market every time you have one of these, like it's just going out for competition. Is that correct? For A&E you are? Gotcha. Now for the other types of services that aren't A&E, or do you still go out to market? That's right. Yeah, personal and purchase services. Got it. So if it's not A&E, you're basically open to just make a source selection, just make sure prevailing wages are included as applicable then. So it's open for like informal, we just go select a provider essentially. Got it. Okay, thank you. There was one that didn't have a name on it, but it looked like the threshold was 10,000 for the informal, but then when it goes from 10 to 80, you guys are doing an informal. Which conservation district was that has an $80,000 limit on it? Yep, it was Blue Pen, yes. So you're 80,000, you go out to market. Okay. And then Grace Harbor, I think that one's you're just doing an alignment like you had before on the equipment. It's all 300 across the board there. Okay. So a large majority of the conservation districts are just using alignment. These are the ones that, so which conservation district are you? Snohomish, thanks. So I'll send all this out after, so you'll have the summary of that. So let me make that update real quick. All right. Thank you for indulging me with that. I was just curious what the services space looked like. My assumption was in services, it probably was going to be pretty much in alignment across the board. So that it did align. I figured in the goods and equipment, like we did earlier, it was going to be different, which it was, just because people have different needs and different times they may have put those policies in place. Okay, I'm going to get back into our presentation here. Okay. So we covered the different recommended guidelines for these. And as we talk about them today, I wanted to talk about a few different terms you're going to hear that we discuss, because there's an intricacy between the both of them. Now, I'll also say, in my career, when I heard RFQ until I joined MRSC, I always looked at it as request for quote. It's not what it means. It took me a little bit to get that in my head. So RFQ is a request for qualifications. And why that is important is when you're doing a request for qualifications, the important element in it is qualifications only. There's no costs involved in it. So that's why it's specific and called out that way. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But then there's also the RFP, which is the request for proposals. The unique elements there, it does have the qualifications as part of that selection, but also the cost is then combined within that. So that's why they're in there separately. And depending on the service type, the RFQ is more important to know that that is the process of qualifications. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So the very first service I'm going to talk about today is personal services. So, and as I said, as I started this, personal services and professional get melted together sometimes when you talk about the two different things. But when I'm talking about personal services, these are really like a technical expertise type project that you need done. So you're basically contracting with someone based on the things they know, for what's in their brain, what's in their mind, all the experiences they've had, or what you're contracting for. So it's intellectual in nature, and it's not A&E services, which is a specific type of need. So some examples of these: you need someone to facilitate a meeting, strategic planning, legal services, or like a comprehensive plan. These are all personal services examples that you may do at the conservation district. Now this one is widely used, and this is where, in this space, you may cross over into prevailing wage territory. So purchase services. The difference between purchase services and personal services is this is usually routine, necessary, and continuing functions related to physical activities. So this is really where someone's using, a repetitive, they're using their body to do the function. They're doing the work, physical work here. It's repetitive, routine, or mechanical in nature. So what that means, routine, mechanical, means it's a type of service you can buy from almost anywhere, and it's going to be the same type of service. A cleaning service, janitorial service, it's always going to be the same type of thing they're going to do. Kind of like, think of it as a service off the shelf. No matter who buys it, it's the same type of service. So some of these examples: delivery, courier service, landscaping, herbicide application, and then vehicle inspection. Now, we talked about earlier today, some of these require prevailing wage, just like public works. And so what you're seeing here, this is an example from our contracting for services guide that lays out some different ones that are out there. And depending on what it is, whether it's a full public work. So as I mentioned this morning, what a full public work means, why it's in that category, is because it's considered a full public work project. You've got prevailing wage. You've got bonds and retainage. So it's a full public work project that meets that definition of public work. If it's a purchase service that requires prevailing wage, that means prevailing wage is the requirement. It doesn't have the retainage and the bonding requirements that you'd see, but you do have that prevailing wage piece. And then there are some purchase services that don't have prevailing wage. And I'm going to point out one and make that distinction of where you're going to see a purchase service without prevailing wage. And that very top one is HVAC monitoring. Now, an HVAC maintenance contract would be prevailing wage, and why monitoring is not is this. When you have a service contract for someone that they're not using tools, they're really just observing or looking at something, and they're not using tools to do the work, that's where it can just be a purchase service and there's no prevailing wage required. What I've come to see in this is when you've got a purchase service contract and they're using tools to do that work, more than likely it's going to have prevailing wage with it because they're actually using their tools and then fixing something, or they're maintaining it. When they're maintaining it with a tool, it's prevailing wage. So I shouldn't have said fix, because fix then puts it into public work. Once you fix something, you're not just maintaining it. So you fix it, you're changing what it is, and then jumps into the public workspace. If they're just maintaining it, keeping it in good working order, even when they're using tools, that's a purchase service. If they're just looking at it, then it just becomes a purchase service with no prevailing wage. So those are the different buckets where you can have a distinction on a certain type of service and what may need to happen there. This is a reference point that's in our guide for services, and I have a link to that after the fact, but this is a chart that kind of lays out the different things. Yeah.
In that HVAC example,
Yep.
so they're doing normal maintenance, and they decide that XYZ part needs to be replaced. Is that still maintenance, or is that now a repair?
That then becomes a repair, right? They're actually fixing it.
So now I have to go out for a public works contract since then?
Yeah, because a repair technically is a public work because they're actually doing it and a repair, they're improving that product. They're not just doing a maintenance anymore. They're not just keeping it in working order. They're actually doing a repair. To me, I think that's the fine line that jumps it into the public work.
Right, but what I'm saying, though, is, okay, it's 110 degrees no problem, and I have to wait until I do a public work, advertise for 13 days and do all that stuff until I can get there. You just do that?
Well, now the other piece I'd say in that case, is it somewhere where it's an emergency? Is it, if,
Yeah, but then I have to have a board. To do that, so you have the
Sure.
declaration of the emergency.
sure.
My
Sure.
board hates meeting on special meetings, so it's once a month, so now I'm waiting 3 weeks for the board,
Right.
then another 13 days for one, no, I can.
Yeah. So I think it's a fine line when it becomes a fix. So my guidance is, I think you have to use your best judgment of the best way to do it. Now, the other piece I'd say in the public workspace to look at the dollar amount, because I think an HVAC repair hypothetically may not meet that 350. Is it one of those informal where you could source it?
It's more like 300.
So that's where if you in policy had that direct contract with someone, you could select somebody and still meet the public works requirement. So I don't giving you a hypothetical where it may still be a public work, but yet based on the dollar limit, you could do direct selection and then just set up the contract so it covers all the requirements that you need for a public works repair. Yep. So vehicle maintenance and repair is totally outside of, it's just a purchase service. There's no prevailing wage required on that because it's not part of your infrastructure. And so the only time prevailing wage comes in is this. So when you think about a maintenance thing, if it's something that could be categorized under the public works bucket, right? Because how prevailing wage is required is when it could meet the definition of a public work, right? So anything that could potentially be a public work overall already requires prevailing wage. So that's where sometimes, even though it's not a full public works project, it still has a prevailing wage requirement. Now, vehicle maintenance doesn't start out in that bucket of public work, right? So it's already fully separate. It's already outside of that. If I visualize like a bubble, that bubble of something that could be in that prevailing wage space is something that could potentially start out as a public work project. If it doesn't start out there, it won't end in that prevailing wage space. So yeah, vehicle maintenance is one that gets a lot of questions, right? Because you think they're doing a repair, but it's not starting out in that public works arena. Yeah, so the answer, because it's been in statute for a while, so my answer to that broadly is the questions around janitorial. So my broad answer on that is because as that public works RCW has language in it, janitorial services called out in it. So that's why it still requires prevailing wage. So they somehow at some point in time determined that it falls within the space that prevailing wage is still required for it because it's specifically called out in there. That's one of the ones that applies to it. So that is why. Now, I'm going to give you an example of something that can touch into both spaces here. So let's look at landscaping. Okay. So I'm going to give you two different examples where it crosses over spaces. So if they're mowing the lawn, okay, that is a purchase service that could be subject to prevailing wage. If they're planting the trees, they're now taking a shovel or digging in the ground planting, that now becomes a public work subject to all the requirements of prevailing wage, bonding, retainage. So that's one of those ones that depending on what you're doing. Now, the other one I was going to use, which you brought up, is an HVAC maintenance contract, right? If they're only inspecting it, keeping it in good working order, that's probably just a purchase service subject to prevailing wage. But once your contract has a maintenance element, I'm going to make repairs when they come up, that's probably a public works contract where you're going to have retainage, bonds, all those pieces. So like, are they just keeping it in good working order or are they making a repair? That's going to put it fully into the public works bucket once a repair comes into play. See, a couple of. Right. So in the last 2 years that I've been part of MRSC, I'm starting to look at these two spaces like this when you think about your purchase service and your public works is like more times than not, if you've got a maintenance contract and that role is tied to somewhere that you may have an L&I job class for, it may just be prevailing wage. We always have to factor in, I may have prevailing wage here as long as it's just maintaining something. Now, once I start doing fixes and repairing it, changing the way that piece of equipment started, it may, or that infrastructure, that thing they're doing maintenance on, it then becomes a public works project, subject to all the bid laws. So these are just some examples of some different things. Another, yes, yes. Nope, correct. So one of the questions is if they're planning it into a pot, then yes, that wouldn't be, because they're not actually doing any, because you think digging in ground is improving or changing your property essentially. Putting into a pot is not doing that. They're just setting it down on something. So that one would not be a public works project, in my opinion. So each one of these to me, when you look at it, you have to stand back and say, what are they doing here? Are they doing something that potentially already starts out in that bucket of public work? And then is it really not repairing it or fixing it? Is it just maintaining it? Then it maybe just be a prevailing wage type situation. Yep. Great question. So I think what you're asking is if I already know I may have something that may cross over into the space of a public work, could I just put my whole project ask out there as a public work? And the answer is yes. You could decide just to do all those requirements right up front, so it's already there. Yeah, if groundskeeping's like mowing and raking and stuff, that's just they're going to pay prevailing wage because they're not actually doing anything where they're, digging in or doing anything onto the property. And they're not, like if they're doing tree trimming and all those pieces, then that might get you into the public workspace. Yes, if you've already got bonds, retainage, all those pieces in there, then you should be covered. Yep.
Side by side with the laborer doing installation. Can you just become a laborer per prevailing wage?
Yeah, essentially, depending on what the installation is, it possibly could be just a prevailing wage type situation. It'll depend on what the scope of what they're doing is, but yes, potentially it could just be a prevailing wage type situation. Okay. So I touched on this earlier. So the consideration they have here is when it does fully fall into that purchase services space, you don't need bonds and retainage on there like you would in that full public works project. So that's the thing to keep in mind is that you're in the purchase services space. It's just the retainage thing you have to consider there if it really does fall into that category. And the other piece that's come up, I'll make this has come up recently. So let's say your purchase service contract is $50,000. So I'm only paying prevailing wage. like we talked about earlier this morning on a public works project, if it was over 50, you'd have to do that notice of completion. Well, when you're in a purchase services space and it wasn't a full public works, you don't have to do a notice of completion, even though it's over that 48,000 amount. So something that's come up recently. So just want to put that out there too. So purchase services, a lot of things to think about there depending on the type of service that you're doing. And so, like I said, I referenced, because I actually go to it a lot myself as I'm working with customers. In our contracting for services guide, we have that chart that I shared with you there. And actually, I'm going to back up a second too to actually make this more in alignment. So let's look at this chart. And what I also did, so we can talk through this too, just for a moment. I'm going to pass this out. This is actually from the conservation guide. There's some examples in here tied to this kind of concept. So let's talk through these real quick. All right. So I thought this was a great piece in addition to this chart that we're looking at, because these are some things that are called out as some examples that you may do at a conservation district, and kind of the same concept of whether you got to pay prevailing wages or not. So the very first one's kind of what we talked about this morning. When it's agency employees, there's no prevailing wage required there. So that's the thing to remember. Anytime, even when it's outside of your own agency, another government entity, don't worry about the prevailing wage part, not applicable. So this one, the next one is like a seasonal work. And so if you're hiring a contractor to do that, then yes, prevailing wages are required. And then the next example is where you're hiring your own staff again. So that gets rid of that prevailing wage requirement. And then our next you got a heavy equipment operator is a sole proprietor. So this is the scenario we talked about this morning where they're a sole proprietor. So they don't have a requirement for prevailing wage, and they still have to file the statement of intent. So that part can be covered, that because it potentially would have been a prevailing wage job, but since they're sole proprietor, they meet the exemption, but they still need to follow through with filing the paperwork to confirm that they're not going to have that requirement to pay it. So you still need to follow through with that piece of it. So then our next one is where you've got a contractor who's got people working for them to do this work. Yes, across the board there, right? They're doing something that's public work. And so those intents and affidavits are there. And then the last one's a landowner hires a crew to install a cost shared project. So their crew, there's no requirement for the prevailing wages there. All right, so this is just some real life examples of some of the things we talked about. Yep, got a question in the back. It looks like two. Oh. Correct. Yeah, so if it's a government entity, you won't have to pay prevailing wage. However, with some nonprofits, you probably will have to pay prevailing wage because there's a distinction if you have a nonprofit that's fully using volunteers. Now, if they're paying employees, then yeah, you'd probably have a prevailing wage requirement there because they're still doing that work for you and they're a paid employee of that organization. I think there's a question. I'd have to look into that one. I don't know the answer to that specific one. Want to give any background on that, Mike? Okay, I'll make a note to look into that about the stream restoration one. I'll make a note here real quick. Okay, and I think there was a question there first and I'll come back. That's when I would get an L&I determination on. My initial thought is yes, because you've got a contract with that nonprofit to do the work, but they're having a contractor do it for them, but you're still having the contract to have that work done. I'm thinking it could be a prevailing wage because you've got someone doing a public work type project. Yeah, I'm thinking that one. Yeah, so basically, if it's a service and they're just maintaining it and keeping it in good working order, the thing to look for is there's a job class at L&I that falls under. You probably still have a prevailing wage requirement when you're doing just a purchase service. That's not a full public work, but if there's a job class that's out there for it, you probably still have the requirement to pay prevailing wage on a purchase service. Correct. Yeah, so the question was if they're just doing outreach, yes. If they're really doing just like this, that's more of that personal services space where you're having them do like using their technical expertise to do outreach, right? They're not working with tools, they're just using their intellectual properties to go out and do work. That's your personal services space. No prevailing wage required. I think we had one question over here on the right too. Okay. So we did the personal, the intellectual property. You've got consultants doing analysis using their experience. Then we got the purchase services where they're doing keeping things in good working order, right? So sometimes it's got prevailing wage involved. And then we've got professional services. There's a distinction there in what professional services are. And the reason I say that they're separate than personal is how I separate them is when you talk about professional services, they're defined in statute on what they are. That's your architecture and engineering services. And each of those roles is defined in statute of what it means to be any of those categories. So that's why they're called professional services versus the personal. They actually have an RCW that guides how those are defined. Okay, here's what's unique about these professional services for A&E. We talked about the distinction between the RFQ and the RFP early on, and why those two things are different. When we're doing A&E services, the RFQ is how you go to market for these. Qualifications only, no price included in that ask for these services. You're selecting them strictly off how they're qualified to do this work. So how you're making that selection, you get a non-cost proposal from them, and you're looking at those experience levels based on the needs of your project to make that selection. So basically what you do is I've got 3 requests for proposals submitted to me. I select the one that's the most qualified. I contact them, say, we're selecting you as the most qualified. Let's talk about pricing for this scope of work. If we can't come to an agreement on the price for my scope, I then move to the next provider. So I'm not making my source selection that way, but I don't have the price discussion until I know which direction I want to go with my award. Then I'm just going to confirm the pricing aligns with what I did an estimate to figure out how much this was going to cost. Can we agree on cost? If not, go to option B, C, see if we can reach an agreement based on the qualifications. So for doing these, you have to do a notification in advance. Now you can do this one of 2 ways. You can go out, as was mentioned earlier, every time you have one of these, you can just put a notice out there that you're seeking qualifications for these. Or you can do a broad notification. And that may be where if you have something that you could do an on-call contract for. So there's a couple different ways you could do this. So I'm going to pause there for a moment. So we covered all 3 of those services really quickly. But what I'm hoping for is the distinction of those 3 different types. So my 3 distinctions are this, again, is personal. That's just really where we're using their technical expertise. Purchase services is they're doing those repetitive tasks that you can basically buy that service off the shelf to do. And then professional services are those architects and engineers defined in statute that I only select them based off their qualifications. So those are your 3 service types when we look at this space. So this is from our services publication. Again, this really breaks out the different ways you go to market for these types of services. You'll notice when you look at these things, there's a lot of overlap in how you select all these providers. Now, the one thing I'm going to point out here, when I talk about overlap, so I'll use the example of our professional services, your A&E contracts. You do those off a RFQ, that qualification-based selection process. if you're going to market for, let's say, personal services, you could use the RFP process or the RFQ process, because generally in an RFP, you're using cost and qualifications. You could use an RFQ as well for the personal service. You could use both in those spaces. So that's why I point that out. So that one makes, you could use both of those opportunities there to make that source selection. And generally with purchased services, those are generally your lowest cost because it's usually based on price, right? There's usually an off the shelf service to do like a maintenance. You're probably going to go with the best price for that to get that work done. So as I mentioned, we have a services page, and there's a contracting for services document that we've created, a publication that goes over services in general and breaks down all 3 different types again. It's also in the conservation guide, but this is an additional publication that goes more in depth, especially when we talk about those A&E contracts. If you're doing them for the first time, it has a lot of different things to consider for those. And I added the contracting manual for the ports as well, just so you can see a different entity that really gets to set their own approach to this and see how they're doing it. All right, I'm gonna, pause for just a moment and see. Any more general questions is just services overall? Yeah. Got it. So if you're saying cultural service, are they doing like things like interviews and things like that? Are they doing things like interviews and things like that? Yeah, doing online research and things. Yep. Yep. Yes, for field work, online research, and interviewing. Yeah, I'd say yes, that's a personal service. Any other general services questions? Okay. Well, part 4 is one of my favorites.